From the vast Slavic plains emerged a people of traditional and austere customs. A people who built a Christian empire that, in the 19th century, was emerging as a geopolitical, economic, and cultural power. That threatened the hegemony of the other world powers. Yet from the core of imperial Tsarist Russia, a young man of sharp insight, intelligence, and undeniable audacity also emerged. With his revolutionary ideas and actions, he would shake the foundations of the greatest empire of the time. Helped by powerful foreign interests, enemies of Russia, and with the unsuspected financing of the great magnates of international banking. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, also known as Lenin, marked a turning point in the 20th century. As the father of the Bolshevik Revolution, which overthrew the 1,000-year-old institution of the Russian Tsardom, and as the founder of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and of Marxism-Leninism, which deeply influenced the history of other countries around the world. Join us to discover this fascinating story full of intrigue and surprises, with information that has been little known until now. This is Reynaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches speaking, and this is the New Encyclopedia. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov was born on April 22, 1870, into a well-educated and prosperous family in Simbirsk. Simbirsk was a region of the Russian Empire located on the banks of the Volga River, about 800 kilometers from Moscow. He came from a well-educated and close-knit family. The young Vladimir was the third of 6 siblings. His father, named Ilya, was a public official with a university education who worked as a school inspector in the service of the government. Vladimir's paternal grandparents, later known as Lenin, were born in Russia and were a well-off family belonging to a people of Mongol, Turkic, and Caucasian origin. On his mother's side, his maternal grandfather was a wealthy Jewish doctor, born in Odessa, who converted to Christianity in adulthood to assimilate into Russian society. His maternal grandmother was the daughter of a successful German merchant. Vladimir's origins were multi-ethnic, just like the very makeup of the Russian Empire in which he was born. However, the majority people of this vast empire were the Russian ethnic group, descended from ancient Slavic tribes that began to come together around the 9th century AD. In the famous federation known as Kievan Rus, located in what is now Ukraine. After centuries of wars and migrations, these Slavic groups founded the Tsardom of Moscow, or the Russian Tsardom, in 1547, with its capital in present-day Moscow. This was under the command of Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible. The monarch of Moscow was the first to adopt the title of Tsar, which was the Slavic adaptation of the imperial title Caesar. The Russians were a traditional people with deep-rooted Orthodox Christianity and a conservative morality typical of the Slavic steppes. Several of the leaders of the Russian people considered themselves the so-called Third Rome as successors of the Byzantine Empire, which was the Second Rome. The Russian Tsardom begins a process of strengthening and expanding as a people, until Tsar Peter I, or Peter the Great, in 1721 proclaimed that his state would now bear the name of the Russian Empire, an empire that was already consolidated as one of the main European powers. This in turn becomes a gigantic multi-ethnic empire with provinces in much of Europe, Asia, and even America, with Alaska. It was the world's largest country by territory, and by the late 19th century, it had 120 million people. At that time, it was still one of the few Christian empires standing in the world, whose state had not yet become a republic or a parliamentary monarchy. Unlike the usual notion of a prolonged Tsarist Russia, by the end of the 19th century, Russia's industrial growth rate was twice that of Germany and 3 times that of the United States. It also had vast natural resources and intellectual and cultural growth that kept Russia competitive. to become the world's leading power. But we'll come back to this later. Returning to young Vladimir, born in this empire, he enjoys a secure, comfortable childhood. While his father rises in government service, he eventually receives the title of state counselor, which gave him the right to be addressed as Your Excellency within the hierarchical Russian society. After obtaining this prestigious title, it was expected that Vladimir, his son, and his older brother, Alexander, would follow their father's example when they completed their academic training. However, the story would turn out very differently. Much of young Vladimir's childhood revolved around school, because he was a very dedicated student, passionate about reading and learning, and was ranked as the best student in high school. Talented in several areas, including Greek and Latin, but while he was projecting a promising future, two surprising events changed the course of his life. The first of them happened in 1886, with the sudden passing of his father due to a heart attack when he was only 54 years old. A few months later, just as Vladimir was about to enter university, another big problem hit the family. When his brother Alexander, who was a committed anarchist, was arrested for participating in a conspiracy aimed at assassinating the Tsar of the Russian Empire, Alexander III, for this conspiracy that his brother bravely took responsibility for. At the trial, he was executed in 1887, two events, without which perhaps the Lenin we know today would not have existed. A tragic moment that awakened in him his intense commitment to the revolutionary cause. Tsar Alexander III had ruled the Russian Empire since 1881. He was part of the Romanov dynasty, the Orthodox Christian royal family that ruled the Muscovite Tsardom from the 17th century, leading it to its greatest imperial splendor, which we have discussed and where Lenin's family was born. Since those 95 Theses of Luther onward, the ghosts of modernity were spreading throughout the world, and especially in Europe. Not just the ghost of communism, as Karl Marx said, but also the ghosts of its father, socialism, and its grandfather, liberalism. Revolutionary ideas and movements that sought to end the old Christian and monarchical order and replace it with a new one kept proliferating, where reason, technology, and the individual would reign above metaphysical values. Liberals, nationalists, socialists, communists, anarchists like Lenin's brother and various groups were shaking the world's foundations toward a new horizon. The Russian Empire had received several of these influences from the West and was modernizing, but at its own pace by the end of the 19th century. Despite this, it remained one of the few states in Europe and in the world that continued to maintain its old traditional structures. Following his brother's execution, Vladimir's family fell under the Tsar's secret police surveillance. And although this did not prevent Vladimir from enrolling in the law school at Kazan University, even so, the young Lenin began to devote himself to political activism and revolutionary groups, and his stay was eventually cut short. After being expelled from the university for participating in a student demonstration, after the expulsion during the following years, he continued his academic activities in St. Petersburg as an external student. During this time, the young Vladimir focused on reading revolutionary novels and to philosophers like the German Jew Karl Marx, whose critical analysis of history and capitalism would have a significant impact on the thinking of the young Vladimir. When he was 18 years old, he openly declared himself a Marxist, and 2 years later, he obtained his law degree. He began practicing law in 1891, after settling in the city of Zamara, where he served many clients, especially Russian peasants. However, he complained he couldn't find anyone in the city interested in his Marxist ideas or political discussion. So by 1893, driven by his passions and convictions, he returns to St. Petersburg, which at that time was the capital of the Russian Empire. There, he ends up joining several young people who shared his interest in Marx and in Georg Plekhanov, who was considered the founder of Marxism in Russia. In this way, Vladimir begins to have more and more contact with many Marxists in the city and to participate in their meetings. However, the Tsar's secret police were aware of all his movements, and soon Vladimir would once again find himself in trouble. On his part, by 1894, after the death of Alexander III, his son Nicholas Romanov took the throne as the new emperor of all the Russias. As a result of his activism against the Tsar, Vladimir Lenin was arrested along with other Marxist leaders in December of 1895. He was immediately sentenced to 3 years of internal exile in Siberia, where he was also joined by Nadezhda Krupskaya, a colleague of his who would eventually become his future wife. While isolated, he wrote for socialist magazines and translated from English to Russian with his wife. The famous work, The Theory and Practice of Syndicalism, written by 2 of the founders of the controversial Fabian Society of England, who were also pioneers of British socialism. After his release from Siberia in February 1900, Vladimir went to Geneva, Switzerland. There, he met with several members of the Marxist group called Liberation of Labor to found the newspaper Iskra, which translated as The Spark. Later, they ended up settling in Munich, Germany, where they published the first issue of the newspaper on Christmas Eve. This newspaper was printed in Germany and secretly brought into Russia. From this point on, Vladimir, like many other revolutionaries, adopted the pseudonym Lenin. Inspired by the Lena River, which was considered one of the longest in the country, from that moment on, Lenin devoted most of his time to writing articles for Iskra, becoming its main writer and perhaps the most intellectual one. He ended up writing more than any other contributor to the newspaper. In the first 2 years, he wrote a total of 32 articles and served as a fundraiser. Regarding Lenin's personality, it can be said that throughout his life he always maintained a cautious curiosity about everything around him. Driven by his great intelligence and sharp memory, he was an avid reader and a passionate debater, possessing great oratory skills that would undoubtedly serve him well later on. Among his main hobbies were hunting, riding a bicycle, playing chess, and listening to classical music. However, Lenin, according to his brother Dmitry Ulyanov, suffered from dramatic mood swings, being able to go from the electrifying ecstasy of his speeches to pure indifference and antipathy once he returned to reality. In a short time, the newspaper Iskra had officially become the newspaper of the so-called Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, a party that would forever shape that country's history. At that time, that party had already become the main socialist party in Russia. Founded in 1898, this party sought to unite the Russian Marxist groups in their different branches to overthrow the monarchy and take power. In addition to being staunch Marxists, a striking aspect of the Social Democratic Labor Party is that it was made up of a large proportion of Jews, as noted by Theodor Herz, one of the founders of Zionism worldwide. During his visit to Russia in 1903, when he met with the Tsar's Minister of Finance, named Count Vita, he himself notes that more than 50% of the leaders and members of the revolutionary movements belong to this Hebrew religion. Another aspect that has been a topic of debate is the well-established idea that by these years, at the start of the 20th century, the Russian Empire was a very backward nation, with a population nearly enslaved compared to the rest of the world. The reality, however, is that the living conditions of Russian peasants, the working class, and the middle class were not different. At times, it was even better than in other democratic European capitals, where workers crowded into cities and rural people faced many hardships. What is true is that during the reign of Nikolai II, the average monetary income of Russians tripled, and a level of industrialization was achieved that surpassed the rest of Europe. Agriculture was expanding, and the number of hectares owned by peasants or small farmers doubled. At the same time, during that period, more than 10,000 schools were opened every year. Russia had the highest number of women with university degrees, and labor rights and workers' unions were substantially expanding. There was a vigorous artistic and cultural life in that Tsarist Russian Empire. In the metropolis, many large-scale public health plans were also created. Russia experienced the largest growth of Christianity at that time. At the start of the 20th century, the Russian Empire was the biggest threat to the industrial, financial, and geopolitical dominance of the United States, Great Britain, and Germany. Wasn't Russia dealing with various issues like other European countries? Even though the Russian Empire had a significant relationship with international banking, it was a distant relationship in which the Russian market remained the largest untapped market in the world, not yet fully co-opted by international capital based in Great Britain or the United States. So let's go back to the year 1902. This year, Lenin gained more notoriety as the Marxist intellectual leader. That year, he began writing a new pamphlet the size of a book, which would be called What is to be Done? Burning Questions of Our Movement. This work marks the beginning of the doctrine that would soon be coined as Leninism, while Lenin was still alive, and it would be of enormous influence up to our days in the practice of politics all over the planet. In this work, Lenin dedicates himself to making concrete proposals about the organization and strategy that the Revolutionary Party should follow to take power. Leninism would be the interpretation of Marxist ideas, practically adapted to the historical period of Tsarist Russia and early 20th century Europe. In the work, What is to be Done? Lenin disagreed with the revolutionaries who reduced the struggle of the working class to the gradual achievement of improvements in their material conditions. And he also criticized the violent direct action groups who expected the masses to simply rebel through mere spontaneous incitement. Lenin argued that beyond the working classes, Marxists should form a vanguard of revolutionaries organized in a party. A centralized party that should bring together the different Marxist movements and should be led by revolutionaries who were almost exclusively dedicated to the cause. This party, or vanguard, had to carry out long and patient work to spread communist ideas on all fronts, and for the organized, not spontaneous mobilization of the workers. In the case of a predominantly agricultural Russia, according to Lenin, it would be the proletariat of the cities who had to push the peasantry toward revolution. The newspaper Iskra became so popular because of Lenin's work, What is to be Done, that both he and the other editors decided to move their base of operations to England for fear of being arrested in Germany. In July and August of 1903, an event of great importance in this history took place. The Second Congress of the Social Democratic Labour Party, first in London and then in Brussels. This Congress brought together 26 revolutionary organizations with the goal of finally unifying them all. By that time, Lenin, because of his writings and the contacts he had been making, was already a prominent figure in the movement. The importance of this Congress lies in the fact that it ended up consolidating an old division between the two groups, which would be called Mensheviks and Bolsheviks. At this Congress, the Social Democratic wing promoted an organization with a broad working class and union base, and a thesis that it promoted first a bourgeois revolution until finally the capitalist conditions for a proletarian revolution would be in place. Lenin disagreed, on the one hand, that above a mass movement, an intellectual vanguard should be formed to hierarchically lead the revolution. But he also opposed, in turn, the idea of orthodox Marxism that in order to make the revolution, the country first had to reach a high level of capitalist development. Lenin saw capitalist powers as the main force exploiting the masses. It wasn't these powers, but rather the semi-industrialized countries, like Russia. From there, a proletarian revolution would be born, which also had to spread to the rest of the world. Both groups had many other disagreements. but essentially, it was the dictatorship of the proletariat of the Bolsheviks against the gradual path towards socialism of the Mensheviks. The members of the Congress voted between the political program of Yuliy Martov and the political program of Lenin, and the result was the defeat of Lenin's program. However, very soon after, when the party's steering committee is elected, the balance of power changes in favor of the Bolsheviks. And as a result of this comes the name that was coined for the Mensheviks, which means the minority, and Bolsheviks would mean the majority. This would be a struggle that would continue in the coming years. These disputes also impacted Iskra's editorial board, where Lenin became a minority. In addition to his outstanding intelligence and education, Lenin was a natural leader, unwilling to be under anyone else's command. So, after these events, Lenin left the newspaper Iskra in December of that same year, 1903, and moved to Geneva with his wife, Krupskaya. Due to new disputes, Lenin resigned from the party's central committee, opening the way for possible division. By December of that year, he embarked on a discreet lecture tour that took him directly to Paris and then back to Switzerland. At the same time, he founded a new magazine called By Period, which in his tradition meant forward. However, beyond these internal disputes, in a very short time, all eyes would turn to the Russian Empire, as turbulent events were about to take an unexpected turn. Now, in 1904, due to imperialist disputes between the blocs, the Russian Empire goes to war with Japan. After a series of heavy defeats suffered at the hands of the Japanese, Russia's economic situation becomes enormously complicated for the whole society. One of the main reasons for the Japanese victories over the Russians was the strong financial support Japan received in the war from prominent Wall Street bankers who were also connected to old European banking families, such as the case of the American Jewish billionaire Yaakov Schiff, along with other members of the American Jewish community. They not only gave significant financial support to Japan, but also publicly expressed their support for the enemies of Tsarist and monarchist Russia. As paradoxical as it may seem, this banker and others would have a significant impact on the future communist revolution in Russia, as we will see later. Amid the grave situation of the war, protests began to arise from workers and various members of Russian society. One of these demonstrations heads to the Winter Palace, but it is crushed by the Tsarist troops, leaving hundreds dead and wounded. All these events triggered what has been called the Russian Revolution of 1905. Hundreds of protests, strikes, riots, and military mutinies by diverse groups, all opposing the Tsar's regime. By November 1905, Lenin returned to the Russian Empire after 5 years to lead the Bolsheviks during the revolution in St. Petersburg. But as a result of these protests, the Tsar instead commits to granting new civil liberties, making peace with Japan, and creating the Imperial Duma, which would be like a lower house of the Russian parliament, elected by universal suffrage. This caused the protests to decrease and the opposition to become divided, since many of the liberals were satisfied. Meanwhile, the socialist and workers' sectors were seeking the total fall of Tsarism and continued conspiring against it. The Tsar proceeds with reforms legalizing political parties. In May 1906, Russia enacted its first constitution, creating a constitutional monarchy that limited the monarch's power. A fundamental event of this 1905 revolution was the creation of the first workers' assemblies of Russia, also known as the Soviets. The Soviets had been created by official order of Tsar Nikolai as an intermediary body between the government and the workers. The first St. Petersburg Soviet was occupied by Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, and social revolutionaries. At that time, representing the Mensheviks was a Russian Jew of great eloquence and intelligence named Leon Trotsky. Despite the new political openness, the conspiracies of the revolutionaries persisted to overthrow the monarchy. Therefore, the following year, The First Imperial Duma was dissolved and the subsequent Duma remained within liberal and conservative groups or moderate socialists. Likewise, in 1906, the leadership of the St. Petersburg Soviet was arrested, along with other Bolsheviks. And the Tsar admits that he took all these liberalizing measures under coercion, that he actually did not agree with them. So in the following years, he imprisoned and banned several of these opposition groups. And once the revolution of 1905 had calmed down to a large extent, power remained concentrated in the sovereign, who was the emperor of all the Russias. Under Nicolas Romanov. During one of Lenin's brief exiles in the 1905 revolution, he met a young, fierce Bolshevik named Joseph Stalin in Finland. Lenin, for his part, always denounced that the Tsar's program of political openness was full of false promises. When the First Duma was dissolved, the Marxists' attempt at an uprising was crushed, so Lenin ordered the Bolsheviks to leave the country for good. To regroup abroad, Lenin went to Finland and then to Western Europe, where a long exile awaited him. Lenin became somewhat pessimistic after the failure of this revolution, but he remained persistent. He settled in Switzerland and kept track of socialist movements around the world. At the beginning of 1911, Lenin managed to establish, with the help of Inez Armand, a French revolutionary married to a millionaire from the Russian industry, a school on the outskirts of Paris where he gives lectures to students about Marxism and revolutionary tactics. With the support of his wife, Krupskaya, he gave a couple of lecture tours in the fall of that same year until the beginning of 1912. He finally formalized his break with the Mensheviks at a party conference held in Prague. From that moment on, the Bolsheviks operated as an independent organization with their own party apparatus, including a central committee and a new newspaper which this time was called Pravda, which in translation meant the truth. Later on, this would become the official newspaper of the Soviet Union. Russian Marxism was thus divided into two openly opposing factions. As the leader of the party, Lenin chooses Stalin as one of the members who would make up the Central Committee. For their part, the Bolsheviks hold the first meeting of the Central Committee in Krakow, Poland, in November of 1913. Later, Stalin is arrested after returning to the Russian Empire to incite the population, and he ends up being exiled to Siberia, not returning to the west of the country until a few years later. Amid this revolutionary activity, a historic earthquake was about to occur, eruption, due to the clash of different phenomena ranging from religious to economic, geopolitical, which deserve a separate video. In August of 1914, what would later be called the Great War, or World War I, broke out in the historic earthquake by declaring war on Germany. Meanwhile, Lenin was in a village in the south of Poland called Poranin. Marxists remembered that a military conflict in 1905 enabled their first revolutionary attempt in the Russian Empire. Several years later, Lenin wrote that if it hadn't been for the war, his country would have lived for years and decades without a revolution against the capitalists. So, with the aim of taking advantage of these wartime circumstances to make the revolution, Lenin went to Switzerland in September 1915, in the middle of a war where the very existence of the Russian Empire was at stake. Lenin would begin to promote a pacifist propaganda movement within Russia to turn the population against the Russian monarch. There, Lenin begins to establish a friendship with the German government, which was at war with his own country, Russia, both sharing the interest of sowing internal chaos in their enemy nation. After the first Russian victories, eventually, the Russian Imperial Army faces serious defeats. The situation for Tsar Nikolai II was very difficult between the foreign aggressors and the internal revolutionaries who had now joined forces. The emperor maneuvered for several years on multiple fronts to try to hold the situation together. After Russia had the highest industrial production rate in the world, With the First World War, its economy began to collapse. There is widespread scarcity and riots and strikes begin. Amid chaos and war, the monarchy steadily loses control over the population. Parastate organizations emerged to cover what the monarchy could not. The State Duma, made up of liberals and progressives, demanded that the monarchy form a new constitutional government. At the beginning of 1917, in the midst of yet another harsh winter, hunger, and the chaos of war, in St. Petersburg, which had been renamed Petrograd during World War I, a series of strikes broke out among the workers, eventually spreading due to revolutionary agitators. In February, these protests began to take on a political slogan: down with the war and down with autocracy. Clashes begin with casualties on both sides, and the revolutionary organizations arm the workers. Around February, a military company from the imperial garrison, allied with the conspirators, joins the protesters. The parties that initially supported the war now turn their backs on the Tsar. Nikolai II decides to dissolve the State Duma and forms an interim committee to govern. Eventually, the regiments of the imperial garrison of Petrograd also rebel and join the protesters. This was the final blow. Pressed by the general staff of the imperial army, on March 2nd, Nikolai II decides to abdicate the throne that the Romanovs had held for almost 3 centuries. His brother, Grand Duke Mikhail, rejects the crown, aware that the determination of the political forces was to establish a republic. Thus, the nearly 1,000-year-old institution of Russian Tsarism ended. After Romanov's abdication, a provisional government was formed, made up largely of liberals and moderate socialists. This government claimed authority over the empire, but the situation was confusing and tumultuous. At the same time, elections were held to choose the Petrograd Workers' Soviet, a workers' organization that had gained a lot of strength. These Soviets, now with the new political freedoms, spread throughout the country and would become a center of power parallel to the provisional government. This would be the starting point of a struggle between both powers, with an unstable and fragile provisional government that would have continuous changes of cabinets, and with revolutionary workers groups dissatisfied with a liberal republic who wanted more radical reforms than those underway. Meanwhile, Russian Empire allies like Great Britain and France, they actually welcomed the establishment of the provisional government, since they had always viewed imperial Tsarism with suspicion as a threat to their own geopolitical interests. While all this revolution was happening, Lenin was trapped in Switzerland, in a conflict zone that prevented him from moving. The Bolsheviks in Petrograd were scattered. Stalin, on his part, was one of their main leaders, as one of the directors of the newspaper Pravda. But he, along with other Bolsheviks in Russia, seemed more inclined to reunify the party with the Mensheviks and even support the stability of the provisional government. The new provisional government admitted its intentions to continue the war, which led to protests. However, strong patriotic sentiment still existed in Russian society. Not willing to give in to the war, Lenin was strongly opposed to the Bolsheviks accepting the new provisional government, much less supporting it. So furious, he sent letters against this. However, the convergence of higher interests, even beyond mere politics, came together as if by fate to give Lenin the golden opportunity to return to the empire. Many are surprised by this, though it's well documented, that Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution received substantial financial support from major magnates of international banking, without which the revolution probably could not have taken place. They also received support from the German government and the British government. The return of Lenin to Russia, along with several exiled Bolshevik officials, was organized by the German government, which was at war with Russia. In turn, before leaving, Lenin was given substantial funds by the Jewish-German billionaire banker Max Barber, head of the German branch of the Barber banking dynasty. And he also received funds from the Swedish Jewish banker Olof Ashberg, who in turn worked for the Guarantee Trust Company of the United States, which was part of the financial conglomerate of the American monopolist Morgan family. While this was happening, at the same time, William Boyce Thompson, who was a representative of Chase Bank from the other American monopolist family, the Rockefellers, and who was a director of the Federal Reserve of New York. He gives the Bolsheviks $1 million for agitation. This alliance between the international big banking and the Bolsheviks is a phenomenon that deserves another video. But another fundamental example of this is that while Lenin manages to leave on the famous sealed train to Russia, Leon Trotsky exiled in New York during the Revolution. Prominent bankers and foreign intelligence agents also helped him return to Russia. Sir William Wiseman, head of British intelligence in New York, along with the American International Corporation, which was a consortium of the John Pierpont Morgan firm and the Rockefellers, as well as the previously mentioned Yakov Schiff, who had financed Japan against Russia in 1905. They substantially helped Trotsky, not only financially with millions of dollars, but also diplomatically, so that he could travel from New York to Russia without any problems. So, on April 16, 1917, Lenin arrived in Petrograd after 10 years in exile. He arrived with a lot of conviction and quite a bit of money in his pockets, ready to take the reins of the Russian Revolution. A crowd of supporters organized a grand welcome for his arrival. The next day, Lenin published his April theses, in which he proclaimed the need to overthrow the provisional government to consolidate the proletarian revolution, stop the war, confiscate and distribute the land, and hand over the factories to workers' control. The situation in Russia was turbulent and unstable. On one hand, there were failed uprisings by soldiers and sailors in the garrisons around Petrograd, which would later become known as the July Days. With the political chaos in the World War, Lenin's radical ideas were gaining more influence as a solution to restore order. Meanwhile, under Bolshevik leadership, the Soviets actively opposed the liberal provisional government. The Bolsheviks, although they were a minority and in June were still seen as a small group of demagogues, they were forming into squads, training their members in armed combat and hiring armed bands to create a strike force ready to seize power at the right moment. After the provisional government suppressed the military uprising of the July Days, it turned against the Bolsheviks. And Prime Minister Kerensky orders the arrest of the main figures of the party. So Lenin had to go underground once again. But he kept gathering followers, while also sealing an alliance with the influential Leon Trotsky, who would eventually serve as president of the Petrograd Soviet. Meanwhile, the Russian government called Lenin a German agent and unpatriotic, attempting to undermine his popularity. But anarchy was spreading through every branch of government. There was a duality of power throughout Russia between the Soviets and the provisional government. The continuous defeats of Russia in the World War caused the Russian army to begin falling apart. And even some elements of the army joined the Soviets to demand that they take power and end the war. During those months, pro-monarchist uprisings aimed to restore Tsarism or create a new military dictatorship against the Soviets. But they were suppressed by the army and the workers' movements, who were armed and prepared to fight the counter-revolution. Fear of a counter-revolution by the old aristocracy also was radicalizing socialist movements, making them more open to the Bolsheviks' radical ideas. Just like the slogan of all power, the Bolsheviks already held a majority in the Soviets of Petrograd and Moscow. In the agricultural sector, meanwhile, there are peasant uprisings, and many peasant groups begin to take over the lands of their landlords, without waiting for the promised agrarian reform that never happened. The failure of the latest offensives of the Russian army in World War, the desire of many peasant soldiers to join the new distribution of land, is causing the Russian trenches to gradually empty of soldiers. As mentioned, Lenin had long prepared the Bolsheviks, using money and weapons, for an armed coup against the provisional government. So with the provisional government increasingly cornered and the Bolsheviks growing impatient for October, Lenin comes out of hiding and Trotsky and other revolutionary leaders end up giving him their support to carry out the coup. They decide it's time. Thus, in the Petrograd Soviet, a revolutionary military committee is formed, led by Trotsky and made up of soldiers, sailors, and workers. While securing the support or neutrality of the city's military garrison, they prepared to take control of the strategic points of the capital. Finally, the insurrection began on the night of November 6th, almost without resistance. The Bolshevik Red Guard took control of the bridges, the central bank stations, and the central post and telephone office, until they delivered the final blow by taking the historic Winter Palace. Only a few battalions of cadets faced the revolutionary insurgents, although it was later presented as a great battle. The truth is that the vast majority of Russian soldiers did not oppose the Bolsheviks. This revolution, which defined the 20th century, began with minimal bloodshed. The next day, the city continued its daily life practically as normal. One day after the Winter Palace was stormed, the All-Russian Congress of Soviets meets, and Trotsky announces the provisional government's dissolution. Although the Mensheviks and right-wing socialists left the Congress, the Bolsheviks still ratified it. The creation of the Council of People's Commissars as the foundation of the new Russian government. In this way, St. Petersburg, the center of power of the most extensive imperial government on the planet, had changed hands in a matter of months. From the hands of a group of Christian, noble families to the hands of the leaders of a minority Marxist party, but highly disciplined and uncompromising, composed mostly of non-Christian families. This marked the start of the historic union of Soviet socialist republics. But by November 1917, the Bolsheviks only controlled the main urban centers of the country. If the First World War and the fall of Tsarism had shaken the foundations of Russia, the earthquake that was about to come would upend everything. The harsh Russian Civil War and the revolution of the communists in power were beginning. Don't miss the second part of this story, which will be published in La Nueva Enciclopedia next week. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the video.